Theodore Roosevelt and the American Century. Historical documentary. Among the more than 40 individuals who have held the office of President of the United States, only 4 have been immortalized on Mount Rushmore. George Washington is recognized as the nation's founding father. Thomas Jefferson is celebrated for authoring the Declaration of Independence, and Abraham Lincoln is revered for guiding the country through the Civil War. However, the 4th figure, often referred to as the American Lion during his lifetime, is Theodore Roosevelt. Born in an era devoid of automobiles and telephones, he nonetheless propelled America into the 20th century, effectively shaping the modern presidency. Since Roosevelt's tenure, every president has operated under his considerable influence. He was a dynamic force, brimming with energy and innovative ideas, and his presence was unmistakable upon entering any room. His voice was among the first presidential recordings. Roosevelt famously stated that we cannot allow any group of citizens to endure conditions detrimental to the Commonwealth. He was the inaugural president to travel internationally, and on a notable October morning in 1910, became the first to fly in an airplane. His life was characterized by constant activity. Whether he was reading, writing, birdwatching, hunting, or fulfilling his presidential duties, Roosevelt's interests spanned a wide array of topics, including conservation, nature, and science. He was also a devoted family man. A lover of the outdoors, he lived life with remarkable vigor. Theodore Roosevelt truly embraced life to its fullest extent. His dynamic influence transformed America and laid the groundwork for what would later be termed the American Century. Born in 1858 to an affluent family in New York, Roosevelt's early years were marked by frailty and frequent illness. Encouraged by his father, Roosevelt began a regimen of regular exercise. His father urged him, stating, "You must develop your own physique. You need to abandon weakness." He emphasized the importance of becoming a robust individual through physical activity, sports, and marksmanship. By the time he enrolled at Harvard University at the age of 18, Roosevelt had transformed from a frail child into a vigorous young man. He developed an interest in political science, a field his peers considered beneath his capabilities. However, Roosevelt envisioned himself in a position of authority. As he later reflected, "The individuals I associated with were not part of the ruling class, while others were, and I aspired to join the ranks of the ruling class." At the age of 23, he made history by becoming the youngest individual elected to the New York State Assembly, surprising both friends and family. During the 1880s, the political landscape resembled organized crime. Thus, for someone like Roosevelt to enter politics was akin to declaring an intention to join a criminal syndicate. Nevertheless, he did not share this perspective, as he believed he could effect change. Roosevelt honed his political acumen within the state assembly while enjoying a fulfilling personal life. While at Harvard, he met Alice Hathaway Lee, and they married a year later. In his diary, he expressed, "How I adore her, and I would trust her to the ends of the earth." However, 4 years later, in February 1884, while at the state capitol in Albany, Roosevelt received an ecstatic telegram announcing the birth of a healthy baby girl at their home in Manhattan. Unfortunately, this joyous event was soon overshadowed by a second telegram that arrived later that day, indicating that Alice had become suddenly and gravely ill. Roosevelt hurried home to be by his wife's side and to meet their newborn daughter. Upon his arrival, he was taken aback to discover that his mother was also confined to bed, suffering from a high fever. With Roosevelt by her side, she succumbed to typhoid fever. Meanwhile, upstairs, Alice was deteriorating, her kidneys failing as a result of complications from her pregnancy. It was February 14th, Valentine's Day. Just hours after his mother's passing, Roosevelt cradled Alice as she too breathed her last. The concurrent loss of his mother and his 22-year-old wife profoundly impacted Roosevelt. His diary entry for that day simply stated, "The light has gone out of my life." Overwhelmed by grief, he decided to alter his life's trajectory. He abandoned his political aspirations and effectively retreated to the West. Roosevelt resigned from his position in the state assembly, sold his New York residence, and journeyed to his ranch in Dakota Territory. Although he attempted to adopt the appropriate attire, his Harvard education and affluent background rendered him out of place among the locals, as he was excessively formal. He was more elegantly dressed than anyone else. Cowboys did not wear any specific type of buckskin attire. They donned practical work clothes. Roosevelt held a misconception about cowboy attire and arrived dressed accordingly. The locals doubted his ability to endure even a month as a cowboy. However, during a blizzard, he contributed to the efforts, and when it came time for roundups or breaking cattle, he proved to be as enthusiastic as anyone else. Gradually, the local community began to perceive him as more than just an Eastern gentleman. They grew fond of him. Roosevelt forged friendships that would endure throughout his life. They appreciated his determined spirit, which significantly bolstered his self-confidence. Until that point, he had been a man of the East, rooted in the bustling city. Following his experiences in Dakota, he emerged as a quintessential figure of the West. He found that he connected more profoundly with cowhands, ranchers, and the everyday farmers of the West than he did with the Eastern politicians. He would later remark that his time in North Dakota was instrumental in his ascent to the presidency. After recovering from a significant personal loss and spending 2 years in the West, Roosevelt was eager to re-engage with the sophistication of urban life and politics. In various governmental roles, he distinguished himself by combating corruption and advocating for reforms. Additionally, his romantic life took a new turn with the re-emergence of his childhood friend, Edith Caro. One day, T.R. visited his sister's residence where Edith was present. It remains unclear whether their encounter was coincidental or prearranged, but upon seeing her, he greeted her and realized that his feelings for her had not diminished. She, too, had always harbored affection for him. As they rekindled their relationship, it became evident that this would be the defining romance of his life. Shortly after their reunion, he proposed, and she accepted. Edith proved to be not only an intellectual partner, but also an exceptionally diligent individual. She was prepared to help rebuild his life, accompany him wherever he went, and facilitate his endeavors. The Roosevelt family expanded quickly, and by 1897, they had 6 children. The youngest, Quentin, along with brothers Theodore Jr., Kermit and Archibald, and sisters Alice and Ethel. The family enjoyed their time at Sagamore Hill, their residence in Oyster Bay, Long Island. Life at Sagamore Hill was lively, filled with joy and adventure. They all rode horses and delighted in the company of small animals, including possums, squirrels, and various pets. T.R. actively engaged with his children, relishing his role as a father, whether riding with Edith or embarking on picnics across the Sound. Nevertheless, Roosevelt remained committed to his political ideals, and his speeches garnered significant public attention. We require leaders who embody inspired idealism, individuals endowed with grand visions, who aspire greatly and endeavor to realize their aspirations, capable of igniting the passion of the populace with the fervor of their own fervent spirits. He vigorously supported Republican William McKinley, who achieved the presidency with the largest popular vote majority in 24 years. In 1897, the newly inaugurated president appointed Roosevelt to the position of Assistant Secretary of the Navy. At that time, the U.S. Navy was not the most formidable in the world, possessing only 6 steel-hulled battleships. Roosevelt aimed to strengthen the Navy and was eager for the first opportunity to utilize it. That opportunity arose in Cuba. For 400 years, Spain had maintained control over Cuba. Now the Cuban populace sought independence and was prepared to fight for it. Roosevelt, possessing a strong moral compass, believed that the United States represented the pinnacle of civilization, and as such, had a duty to guide the rest of the world into the future. Thus, when the United States faced what Roosevelt perceived as a regressive civilization, exemplified by Spain in Cuba, he argued that it was in the best interest of the Cuban people, the Western Hemisphere, and potentially even Spain, for the United States to forcibly remove Spain from Cuba. Following Roosevelt's directives, the USS Maine set sail for Cuba in January 1898. A month later, while patrolling the waters near Havana, the Maine experienced a sudden explosion. The cause of this catastrophic event remains a subject of debate. However, America attributed the incident to Spain, and Congress acknowledged Cuba's independence. In a surprising move, Roosevelt resigned from his prominent Navy position, donned the uniform of a volunteer soldier, and made his way to the battlefield in Cuba. Many in Washington viewed this decision as unwise, as he would have wielded significantly more influence over the war's outcome from his position in the capital. Theatergoers at home were afforded a front-row view of Roosevelt's valor through the reenactments of the battle. The Rough Riders advanced amidst intense gunfire, suffering the highest number of casualties in the conflict. After several hours of fierce combat, they successfully captured San Juan Hill. Following this, Spain capitulated. Roosevelt would later reflect that San Juan represented the pinnacle of his life. He indeed showcased remarkable bravery under fire, although the engagement itself was brief, lasting only an afternoon. Consequently, this was a relatively short war, with few notable heroes, and Roosevelt emerged as the most prominent figure. He embraced this role wholeheartedly and maximized its significance. Public sentiment regarding Roosevelt's bravery soared so high that within 4 months of the Battle of San Juan Hill, he was elected as the governor of New York. However, his principled approach to politics clashed with the corrupt practices of the New York political establishment. During the Republican Convention of 1900, local politicians devised a strategy to sideline him by nominating him for the vice presidency. Although Roosevelt was enthusiastic about the vice presidential nomination, he was reluctant to accept it due to the lack of meaningful responsibilities. There was no significant purpose, principle, or noble cause associated with the position. The mild President McKinley sought Roosevelt's youthful energy and charisma to invigorate his campaign, which proved successful. The ticket achieved a record number of popular votes, surpassing any previous presidential campaign. McKinley's campaign manager remarked, "Don't you all realize there's just one life between that damn cowboy and the White House?" However, Vice President Roosevelt was more preoccupied with the realization that he had found himself in a position with limited prospects. He delivered speeches at various events, including the openings of medical colleges, war memorials, and even the YMCA. In the spring of 1901, he led the parade inaugurating the Pan American Exposition in New York. Yet destiny was poised to intervene once more in Roosevelt's life. On September 6th, President McKinley also attended the exposition. While engaging with supporters, he was fatally shot by an assassin. For more than a week, McKinley's survival was uncertain. Just as recovery seemed promising, he unexpectedly passed away. Like many across the nation, Roosevelt was deeply affected. He expressed to Edith, "It is a dreadful thing to come into the presidency this way." At the age of 42, Theodore Roosevelt assumed the role of the youngest president in American history. He was known as a military hero, yet he also had a reputation for being somewhat unpredictable. The nation was uncertain about what to expect from Theodore Roosevelt. The American public held a fondness for the Roosevelts in the White House. The children treated it as their home. They engaged in snowball fights with the White House police. They also hurled icicles at the officers. They roller skated in the East Room and ignited small campfires in the backyard. They would ascend the dumbwaiter and even brought a pony up the elevator. Their time in the White House was filled with joy. As a husband and father, Roosevelt was both generous and playful. While First Lady Edith maintained strict order, the new president would join in the children's play, crawling on all fours beneath tables and around chairs. He shared a strong bond with his children. Some have suggested that this may be attributed to a friend's remark, you got to keep in mind that Theodore Roosevelt is really only 5 years old. Alongside others of their social standing, the Roosevelts enjoyed a life of privilege, mingling with the Astors and Vanderbilts of high society. In stark contrast, the working-class American faced a different reality. The average annual income was $430, translating to approximately $1.37 per day for a typical 6-day workweek. Immigrants continued to arrive at Ellis Island in vast numbers, aspiring to establish new lives as members of the working class in America. This influx of labor significantly contributed to the nation's industrial growth, leading to the accumulation of immense wealth by a select group of entrepreneurs. John D. Rockefeller amassed a fortune nearing $1 billion, while banker and financier J.P. Morgan established the largest corporation in the world. Andrew Carnegie sold his steel enterprise for nearly $250 million. President Roosevelt perceived that this small group of affluent individuals exerted excessive control over the national economy. Within just 5 months of taking office, he positioned himself as a presidential Robin Hood, challenging the industrial magnates and their substantial monopolies. It soon became evident to the nation that they had a president unlike any they had encountered before. Although he hailed from a background of inherited wealth and could have aligned himself with the Morgans and Rockefellers, he chose not to do so. In reality, he stood in opposition to the industrial leaders. Thus, when Roosevelt criticized the malefactors of great wealth and the corrupt elite, he was fully aware of his actions. He understood that for every vote he might lose in affluent Republican areas, he would gain 10 votes from the broader populace. Subsequently, Roosevelt focused on the public sector, initiating a series of social reforms that promised a fair deal for all Americans. This concept entailed ensuring that everyone had an equitable opportunity to succeed, earn a decent living, support their families, and improve both themselves and the nation. One of the initial challenges to his square deal policy emerged from a prominent conflict between labor and management in the coal industry. Immigrant coal miners endured grueling 12-hour shifts under harsh conditions. Young children, some as young as 8, labored alongside their fathers, who earned a mere $12 weekly. In the spring of 1902, a significant strike involving 140,000 miners occurred in northeastern Pennsylvania, as they demanded an 8-hour workday and better working conditions. The mine owners were unyielding, refusing to engage in discussions with the workers and offering no concessions. As winter loomed, President Roosevelt grew concerned that a prolonged coal strike would severely impact the nation. He called both parties to the White House in an effort to resolve the deadlock. However, the mine owners remained steadfast in their stance. Roosevelt was particularly angered by their belief that they were divinely appointed stewards of this vital industry and the lives of their employees. He found this attitude unacceptable. Roosevelt believed it was necessary to humble them. He threatened to deploy federal troops to take control of the mines. After weeks of pressure from the presidency, the workers returned to their jobs, ultimately securing a 10% wage increase and a 9-hour workday. This marked the first instance of a president effectively intervening in a significant labor dispute, resulting in a notable victory for the working class. As the nation expanded, its demand for raw materials surged, with lumber being consumed even more rapidly than coal. Many Americans were under the impression that forests were inexhaustible. Unbeknownst to them, this was a pressing issue. Consequently, Roosevelt recognized that his primary task was to raise awareness among the American populace regarding this problem. He persistently emphasized that the environment belongs to everyone, not just a select few. He famously remarked that future generations would not hold us accountable for what we have utilized, but rather for what we have squandered. During his presidency, Roosevelt designated 230 million acres for national parks, forests, monuments, and game preserves, averaging 84,000 acres for each day he held office. In his second term, he formulated a dual approach to foreign policy that integrated subtle diplomacy with the assertion of military strength. This strategy was encapsulated in the phrase, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." Under his direction, the U.S. Navy, known as the Great White Fleet, comprising 16 ships and 14,000 sailors, embarked on a 2-year global voyage to showcase America's military capabilities. However, a significant challenge arose. Naval and cargo vessels traveling between the coasts were required to navigate around the southern tip of South America, a journey that could exceed 6 months. Roosevelt proposed the excavation of a substantial canal through Colombia, which would significantly reduce both distance and travel time. Colombia, however, declined Roosevelt's proposal. Frustrated by the stalled negotiations, he encouraged a rebellion in the province of Panama against Colombian rule. On November 13, 1903, with American warships positioned offshore, the Panamanian forces declared their independence, leading to the establishment of a new nation. Within 5 days, this new government signed a canal treaty with the United States for $10 million, leaving the displaced Colombians with no compensation. Roosevelt disregarded the formalities of diplomacy. He orchestrated a revolution in Panama, and within 2 weeks of the new government's formation, which was protected by the U.S. Navy, he secured a deal granting the United States a 99-year lease and the rights to construct the Panama Canal. Throughout his life, he remained unapologetic about his actions. As he famously stated, it was preferable to construct the canal first and engage in debate for half a century afterward. The legacy of Roosevelt is most prominently marked by the construction of the Panama Canal, which established a precedent for American involvement in the political affairs of other nations when it aligned with U.S. interests. After 7.5 years of leadership and at the peak of his popularity, Theodore Roosevelt concluded his presidential term. He was assured that the government was in capable hands with his ally, William Howard Taft, and subsequently embarked on a year-long safari in Africa with his son, Kermit. During his presidency, the American public had developed a keen interest in Roosevelt's narrative, which did not fade after he left office. He continued to engage the nation by sending back reports from his hunting expedition, effectively creating a serialized account of his adventures. Thus, Roosevelt remained a prominent figure in the American psyche. Upon his return to New York 15 months later, he was greeted with a hero's welcome. However, the celebrations did not satisfy his desire for action. Eager to take on a new challenge, he accepted the leadership of an independent political movement known as the Progressives. This party, later dubbed the Bull Moose Party in honor of its vigorous leader, campaigned on a platform advocating significant social reforms inspired by his square deal principles. Roosevelt championed initiatives such as workers' compensation, women's suffrage, a national minimum wage, unemployment insurance, pensions for the elderly, and the elimination of child labor. We advocate for a living wage to support education and recreation, to care for young family members, to sustain families during illness, and to ensure reasonable working conditions. It is essential to recognize that the employment of women for more than 48 hours per week is excessive and should be legally restricted. Furthermore, the practice of a 7-day workweek is unreasonable, and it is imperative that the law mandates 1 day of rest in every 7. Despite these progressive policies, they were considered too advanced for the era, leading to Roosevelt's defeat by Democrat Woodrow Wilson. After experiencing this loss for the first time, Roosevelt retreated to private life. He did not remain there for long. European nations were gearing up for a monumental conflict. On August 3, 1914, Germany declared war on France, marking the beginning of World War I. President Wilson firmly believed that the United States should maintain its neutrality in the European struggle. Roosevelt, however, strongly opposed this stance, labeling Wilson's inaction as criminal and characterizing his foreign policy as lacking in vigor and decisiveness. It infuriated him that Wilson, who appeared to have little understanding of foreign affairs and had seemingly given them scant consideration prior to his presidency, was at the helm of the United States and serving as commander-in-chief during the most significant war in history, while he, Theodore Roosevelt, was not. In 1917, the United States officially declared war on Germany. Just 8 days later, Colonel Roosevelt, as he preferred to be addressed, met with President Wilson. By that time, he had lost sight in his left eye, endured considerable hearing impairment, and walked with difficulty due to gout. Nevertheless, he requested Wilson's permission to lead a division of troops into combat. Wilson, however, had ample reason to regard Roosevelt as a political threat and declined his request, advising his aides that the best approach to dealing with Mr. Roosevelt was to ignore him. Roosevelt returned home. No longer a soldier, he could only observe as war consumed the globe. Yet passivity was not in Roosevelt's nature. As America readied itself for war, he emerged as a fervent advocate for the war effort, galvanizing public support and encouraging young men to enlist. With great pride, Roosevelt saw all 4 of his sons join the military. Unable to take up arms himself, he instead ensured that his sons would fight. He utilized every political connection at his disposal to secure their positions in the heart of the conflict. The likelihood of fatality was at its peak for them. Kermit Roosevelt received a British Military Cross in recognition of his bravery. Ted Jr. commanded his troops during the Battle of Cantigny in France. Archie also displayed remarkable valor in combat, sustaining significant injuries. The youngest son, Quentin, served as a pilot, conducting missions behind enemy lines. For the first time, it seems, Roosevelt grasped the true implications of his previous understanding of courage. He had believed that the ultimate expression of bravery was to confront the enemy head-on, risking one's life in the heat of battle. However, he failed to recognize that it could be just as challenging, if not more so, to remain at home, anxiously awaiting news through a telegram. On July 17, 1918, the notification arrived that Quentin was missing in action after being shot down behind enemy lines. Confirmation of his death came 2 days later. He was only 20 years old. His son had demonstrated heroism in battle, yet what was the outcome? He was dead. This left Roosevelt to ponder whether he had been living in a delusion throughout his life. In the final months of Roosevelt's life, acquaintances noted that he would often sit by the window, lost in thought, lamenting, "Poor Quentin." On the evening of January 5, 1919, Roosevelt expressed to Edith that he was feeling unwell and retired for the night. That night, Theodore Roosevelt passed away in his sleep at the age of 60. His son Archie sent a telegram to his brothers in France. It simply stated, "The old lion is dead." Theodore Roosevelt's burial marks a significant chapter in American history. Yet, through that history, he continues to resonate within the nation he helped shape, reflected in the ongoing social reform initiatives to which he dedicated his life. The most prominent aspect of Theodore Roosevelt's legacy today is his significant contribution to conservation, which fundamentally transformed America's perspective on the environment. He redirected the presidency towards new priorities, altering the trajectory of American governance and establishing a robust executive leadership. With Theodore Roosevelt, the presidency assumed a pivotal role in national affairs. He effectively propelled the United States into the 20th century, a transition that, while inevitable, would not have occurred with such urgency and impact without his influence. Throughout his 60 years, Theodore Roosevelt exemplified both the spirit of his era and a vision that transcended it. As an American icon, he seized every opportunity for personal growth and for the advancement of the nation he cherished. In his own words, "The joy of living is his who has the heart to demand it." Thank you for watching. We invite you to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more captivating historical content.